On the afternoon of November 29th, 1970, the hills outside Bergen, Norway, were already carrying the weight of winter. The air was cold, the ground was wet, and in the valley below the north face of Mount Orkin, the silence had the kind of thickness that makes every sound feel too sharp. A man was hiking with his 2 young daughters through Isdal, a narrow, lonely stretch of rock, brush, and shadow that locals had long associated with death. It was not the kind of place where a stranger was expected to leave a story behind. Then one of the girls noticed something unusual. A smell, not wood smoke from a cabin, not the clean burn of a campfire. Something darker, something wrong. A little farther off the trail, among the stones, they found what was left of a woman. Her body had been badly burned. Her face was no longer recognizable. There were objects scattered nearby, some damaged by fire, some strangely ordinary, some almost too carefully stripped of meaning. A watch, a bottle, pieces of clothing, traces of burned paper, and no name, no passport, no clear identity. At first, it looked like a death investigation, but the longer police looked at the scene, the less it behaved like one, because this woman had not simply died in a Norwegian valley. Before anyone found her there, someone had already begun removing her from the world. Labels had been cut away, names had been changed, routes had been hidden, and somewhere behind a burned body in Isdal was a life built out of aliases, hotel rooms, coded notes, and unanswered questions. This is the file of the Isdal Woman. And more than 50 years later, the most disturbing question is not only how she died, it is whether anyone was ever supposed to know who she really was. At first glance, the Isdal Woman case seems to invite one obvious answer. A mysterious woman, false names, foreign money, coded notes, a burned body in a remote valley during the Cold War. It is almost impossible not to see the outline of a spy story. And for decades, that is exactly how the cases live in the public imagination. A woman moving through Europe under different identities. A woman who stayed in hotels, changed details about herself, and left behind luggage that seemed to explain everything and nothing at the same time. A woman whose death appeared too strange to be ordinary, but too incomplete to become a solved crime. But the real mystery is more difficult than the spy theory alone, because this case does not survive only because it looks like espionage. It survives because every explanation leaves something behind. If she was a spy, where's the mission? If she was murdered, where is the killer? If she died by suicide, why did her life look so carefully disguised? And if she was simply a troubled woman moving through Europe alone, why did so many details seem designed to prevent anyone from finding her name? This story is not going to treat rumor as proof. It is not going to turn every strange object into a secret operation. Instead, the file has to be opened carefully. The valley, the body, the luggage, the aliases, the forensic findings, the Cold War atmosphere around Norway, and the one fact that never stopped haunting the case. Investigators had many clues, but not the one clue that mattered most. They had a dead woman. They did not have her name. To understand why the Isdal Woman became one of Europe's most unsettling unidentified dead, the story has to begin before the valley, before the smoke, before the body, before the police photographs and the theories that would follow. It begins in a Europe that was already divided by suspicion. In 1970, the Cold War was not an abstract idea. It lived in borders, embassies, ports, military installations, hotel registers, phone calls, and train routes. Norway occupied a position that made it especially sensitive. It was a NATO country with a long coastline, close to Soviet strategic interests, and deeply aware that the quiet geography of Scandinavia could become important in a world shaped by surveillance and military tension. To most ordinary people, Bergen was not a city of spy fiction. It was a coastal city of rain, mountains, ships, hotels, workers, students, and travelers. But in the wider strategic map of the Cold War, places like Bergen mattered, ports mattered, railway stations mattered, routes mattered, foreign visitors mattered. A person moving through Norway under changing names could be harmless, or troubled, or criminal, or connected to something larger. The problem was that, in that atmosphere, secrecy never looked neutral. It always seemed to cast a longer shadow. And this woman, whoever she was, moved through that shadow with unusual care. In the weeks before her death, she appeared at several hotels using different names and changing personal details. Sometimes she presented herself as a traveler from Belgium. At other times, details shifted. Her handwriting, her language, her behavior, and her movements left impressions, but not a stable identity. Witnesses remembered a woman who seemed composed, well-dressed, and private. She was not described as someone lost in an obvious way. She seemed capable, controlled, careful, the kind of person who could enter a hotel lobby, sign a form, speak just enough, and leave behind an image that felt complete until someone tried to verify it. Then it began to dissolve. This is what makes the world before the mystery so important. The Isdal woman did not appear suddenly out of nowhere when her body was found. She had already been moving through public spaces. She had checked into hotels. She had spoken to staff. She had carried luggage. She had occupied rooms. She had eaten meals, paid bills, taken trains, and crossed through the ordinary machinery of travel. And yet none of those ordinary acts attach her firmly to a real life. Usually, modern systems create trails. A hotel register, a ticket, a passport, a phone number, a person who could be called, an address that leads somewhere, a name that belongs to a family, a town, a record, a memory. But with her, the trail did something stranger. It existed, and still, it did not lead home. That is why the case does not feel like a simple disappearance. It feels like a person passed into the world while preventing the world from keeping her. This was also a time when travel still had a different texture. There were no digital databases linking every movement, no security cameras silently storing every doorway, no phone GPS creating a private map of a person's final days. A traveler could be remembered by clerks, waiters, taxi drivers, hotel staff, and strangers at a train station. But memory is fragile. It changes. It misses details. It preserves moods better than facts. And when the police later tried to rebuild her life from those fragments, they found themselves working with impressions instead of certainty. A woman with dark hair. A woman with an accent. A woman who may have spoken several languages. A woman who seemed elegant to some, suspicious to others, withdrawn to others still. Each witness gave the investigation a piece. But the pieces did not form a face. They formed a silhouette. And inside that silhouette was the central tension of the entire case. She did not look like someone who had simply fallen out of society. She looked like someone who knew how to move through it without being caught by it. That does not prove she was a spy. It does not prove she was involved in intelligence work. It does not prove murder, conspiracy, or state secrets. But it does explain why the case refused to become ordinary. Because before the valley, before the fire, before the official conclusion could settle over the file, there was already something wrong with the shape of her life. A woman had crossed borders in cities under names that did not hold. She had left traces that were visible enough to follow, but never solid enough to identify. And in a Cold War Europe where the line between private secrecy and political secrecy could become dangerously thin, that was enough to turn one unidentified death into a question that would outlive the investigation itself. By the time the body was found in Isdal, the woman had already become difficult to place. But the valley turned that difficulty into a rupture. On November 29, 1970, the discovery moved quickly from a disturbing scene to a police investigation. The body was lying in a rocky, isolated area. Parts of it were badly burned. The position of the remains, the scattered objects nearby, and the absence of identification created the first problem for investigators. They were not simply asking how a woman had died. They were asking who the woman was before death had erased a face. That question should have been the easiest one to answer. In most death investigations, identity is the anchor. It gives police a family, a workplace, a history, a list of enemies, habits, fears, debts, movements, and last known contacts. But here, the anchor was missing. There was no passport on her, no obvious personal papers, no simple name that could be checked and confirmed. Even the items near the body seemed to resist interpretation. Some were ordinary, some were damaged, Some looked as if they had belonged to a traveler, but nothing pointed cleanly back to a life. Then came the details that made the scene stranger. Investigators found signs that identifying marks had been removed from some of her belongings. Labels had been cut away from clothing. The kind of small, practical details people never think about became, in this case, deeply important. Because a label is not just a label when a dead woman has no name. It can be a country, a shop, a manufacturer, a purchase trail, a clue, a small thread connecting a body to the world. And those threads appear to have been cut. The official investigation began moving outward from the valley. If the woman could not be identified from the body, perhaps she could be identified from travel records, hotel registers, witnesses, luggage, people who had seen her, places where she had stayed. Slowly, investigators began to reconstruct the outline of a woman who had been moving through Norway and possibly beyond it under a series of false or shifting identities. She had stayed in hotels. She had used names that did not settle into one verifiable person. She had given details that appeared inconsistent. She seemed to have been traveling alone, yet not aimlessly. There was movement in the file. There was planning. There was pattern. But every time the investigation seemed to find a path, it reached another blank space. Then the case took one of its most important turns. Police located luggage connected to the woman at Bergen railway station. 2 suitcases. In many cases, luggage is where a life gives itself away. People pack carelessly. They leave receipts, letters, photographs, medication, addresses, tickets, something intimate enough to defeat whatever mystery surrounds them. But these suitcases did not give the Isdal Woman back her identity. They deepened the absence. Inside were items that suggested travel, disguise, and movement. Clothing, wigs or hairpieces, eyewear, cosmetics, money from different countries, maps, and notes that appeared coded or deliberately abbreviated. The luggage confirmed that the woman had not been a local accident victim who had simply wandered into the wrong valley. She had been moving through a wider world. But the luggage also failed to provide the one thing investigators needed: a true name. That is where the break in the case became permanent. The police were no longer dealing with a single unexplained death in the hills. They were dealing with a person whose life, in the days and weeks before death, seemed structured around concealment. This does not mean the scene immediately proved espionage. It does not mean murder was obvious. It does not mean the official explanation had to be false. But it did mean that every simple version of the story began to weaken. If she had died by suicide, why carry and preserve so many layers of disguise? If she had been killed, why was there no clear sign of who had brought her there? If she was a traveler in distress, why had she made herself so hard to trace? And if she had been involved in something secret, why did the final scene look so exposed, so improvised, so strangely incomplete? The forensic findings added another layer of difficulty. Investigators found evidence consistent with smoke inhalation, suggesting she may still have been alive when the fire began. There were also sleeping pills involved. This created a grim and complicated picture: a woman drugged or heavily sedated, a fire, a remote valley, and no confirmed identity. The cause of death could be described, but the meaning of the death could not. That distinction matters. A cause of death belongs to medicine. A story of death belongs to investigation. And in the Isdal case, those two things never fully became one. The medical file could point to fire, smoke, and drugs. The police file could point to aliases, luggage, missing labels, and strange travel. But when placed together, the pieces did not form a clean narrative. They formed a contradiction. A woman careful enough to hide herself had died in a way that exposed her to the world. A traveler who left a trail had left no identity. A body had been found, but the person inside the body remained missing. And from that moment forward, the Isdal Woman was no longer only an unidentified victim. She became a rupture in the official order of things. A case where the state could find a body, examine the scene, collect the objects, interview the witnesses, decode the notes, and still failed the first human task of any investigation: to call her by her name. What makes the Isdal Woman case so difficult is not the absence of evidence. It is a behavior of the evidence. There are cold cases where investigators have almost nothing. No body, no witnesses, no timeline, no objects, only a disappearance and a silence where the facts should be. But the Isdal case is different. There was a body, there was a scene, there was luggage, there were hotel records, there were witnesses, there were travel patterns, there were objects that could be photographed, listed, tested, decoded, and filed away, and yet the case still refused to close. The first thing that does not fit is the relationship between concealment and exposure. The woman seemed to have taken steps to hide who she was. Labels were removed, names shifted, personal information changed. Her movements were recorded in a way that was not meant to be easily understood by anyone else. These are not the habits of a person moving through life casually. They suggest caution, maybe fear, maybe training, maybe shame, maybe a need to live outside the reach of ordinary identification. But then the final scene is almost brutally exposed. A remote valley, a burned body, objects nearby, luggage left behind in a railway station, a death that could not remain invisible. If the goal was to disappear completely, the ending was strangely imperfect. If the goal was to send a message, the message was never clear. And if the goal was simply suicide, the preparation around her identity feels far larger than the act itself. The second thing that does not fit is the luggage. Those two suitcases should have been the solution. They should have turned an unidentified woman back into a person. A traveler's luggage is usually careless in the most human way. A receipt folded into a pocket, a scrap of paper with a phone number, a photograph, a letter, a medicine bottle, a ticket, a laundry mark, a private object that no one expected would ever become evidence. But her luggage behaved differently. It was full enough to prove a life in motion, yet empty of the ordinary anchors of identity. It showed a woman who traveled, prepared, changed appearance, carried money, used maps, and maintained records. But it did not show where she belonged. That is the unnerving thing. The suitcases did not look random. They looked controlled, but not controlled enough to explain everything. The third thing that does not fit is the code. The notes found among her belongings have often been treated as one of the strongest signs of espionage, and it is easy to understand why. A dead woman, false names, Cold War Norway, a coded travel record. The imagination almost completes the story by itself, but this is where the case has to be handled carefully. A code does not automatically make a person a spy. People use private shorthand for many reasons: to protect themselves, to remember things quickly, to hide movements from a partner, a criminal associate, a family, a government, or no one in particular. A coded notebook tells us she did not want her movements easily read. It does not tell us why. And that gap is exactly where the mystery grows. Because the code is meaningful enough to matter, but not revealing enough to solve the case. It is a key that opens a door into another locked room. The fourth thing that does not fit is the official simplicity of the death compared to the complexity of the life around it. A suicide explanation can account for some elements: the pills, the fire, the isolation, the loneliness of the location. But the life leading into that death does not sit easily inside such a simple frame. A woman does not need several identities to die alone. She does not need to move through hotels under shifting names. She does not need to remove labels, carry foreign currency, and keep hidden records of travel. Of course, none of this proves murder. None of it proves intelligence work. But it does mean the death cannot be separated from the concealment. The way she lived in the final weeks is part of the evidence. The fifth thing that does not fit is the silence around her. Somewhere, logically, there should have been a person who knew her: a family member, a colleague, a lover, a handler, a victim, a partner, a doctor, a landlord, a border official, someone who recognized the face, the voice, the habits, the absence, someone who noticed that a woman had vanished from the world, and yet no confirmed identity emerged strong enough to end the file. That silence may be the most disturbing evidence of all, because bodies are not usually alone in history. Even people who live privately leave emotional traces. They leave debts, promises, arguments, rooms, names in someone else's mouth. But the Isdal Woman seems to have reached death surrounded by traces that led everywhere except back to a home. And that is why the case still feels unstable. It does not let any explanation rest. If she was a spy, the file lacks a final proof. If she was murdered, the file lacks the killer. If she died by suicide, the file lacks emotional and practical bridge between her hidden life and her final act. If she was involved in crime, the network remains invisible. And if she was only a woman trying to disappear, then the question becomes even sadder. What kind of life makes a person erase herself so thoroughly that, after death, the world can study her body, decode her notes, trace her hotels, open her suitcases, and still not give her back a name? That is the fracture at the center of the Isdal file. The facts are not empty. They are crowded, but they do not align. They point toward secrecy without explaining its purpose. They point toward danger without identifying its source. They point toward planning without revealing the plan. And they point toward a woman who was present everywhere in the investigation, except in the one place she needed to be, inside her own identity. Every lasting mystery creates a vacuum, and every vacuum invites a theory. The Isdal Woman case is no different. For more than half a century, investigators, journalists, researchers, and ordinary readers have tried to place her inside a story that finally makes sense. A suicide, a murder, a spy operation, a criminal network, a private life that collapsed under a pressure no one else could see. Each explanation solves something, and each one fails somewhere. That is why the case does not behave like a puzzle waiting for one missing piece. It behaves more like a map of locked doors. The first and most official explanation is suicide. On paper, this is the simplest version. A woman traveling alone reaches a remote valley. She takes a large quantity of sleeping pills. A fire begins. She dies from a combination of poisoning, smoke, and flames. This explanation has weight because it does not require an unknown killer, a secret operation, or an international conspiracy. It uses what was found close to the body. It explains the isolation. It explains the drugs. It explains why there may have been no attacker visible in the file. And in many investigations, the simplest explanation would be the one that survives. But the problem is not whether suicide is possible. The problem is whether suicide is enough. Because the suicide theory has to carry more than the final scene. It has to carry the aliases, the cut labels, the coded notes, the foreign money, the changing hotel identities, the luggage left behind, the movement across cities, the careful absence of anything that could easily restore her name. A person can die by suicide while hiding their identity. That is possible. But in this case, the hiding seems so layered that it begins to look like a second story sitting underneath the first. If suicide explains how she may have died, it struggles to explain why her life had become so difficult to trace before she got there. The second explanation is murder. This theory begins with a different instinct. Maybe the valley was not chosen by her. Maybe the fire was not entirely her act. Maybe the pills were not taken freely. Maybe the scene was made to look like a self-inflicted death because someone needed the case to end there. That suspicion grows from the nature of the scene itself. A remote location, a woman without a name, a body damaged by fire, a life surrounded by false identities. It is not hard to imagine violence entering the file. The murder theory also answers one emotional need that the suicide theory does not. It gives the mystery an adversary, someone who knew who she was, someone who had a reason to silence her, someone who understood that if her identity vanished, the investigation would lose its center. But this theory has its own weakness. It gives the case a shadow, but not a face. No confirmed killer emerged. No motive became strong enough to carry the file. No relationship was proven clearly enough to explain why this particular woman ended up in that particular valley. A murder investigation needs a human chain. Victim, suspect, motive, opportunity, evidence. But because the victim's identity was never secured, that chain never fully formed. This is one of the cruelest features of the case. Without her name, Even the possibility of murder becomes harder to investigate. You cannot fully search a woman's enemies if you do not know her life. You cannot map her final relationships if you do not know which relationships were real. You cannot ask who wanted her dead until you know who she had been alive. The third explanation is the one that made the case famous beyond Norway. Espionage. The spy theory has always had a powerful hold on the Isdal file because it seems to arrange the details into a shape the public recognizes. The Cold War, a NATO country, strategic locations, false names, hotel rooms, a coded notebook, travel patterns, foreign currency, remove labels, a woman who seemed composed, multilingual, and careful. In another context, each of these facts might be explainable on its own. Together, they create an atmosphere. An atmosphere is dangerous in mystery cases because it feels like proof before it actually becomes proof. The spy theory sounds persuasive because it gives purpose to the concealment. If she was involved in intelligence work, then the false identities make sense. The coded notes make sense. The erased labels make sense. The absence of a clean background makes sense. Even the silence after her death begins to feel meaningful. Maybe no one came forward because no one could. Maybe the people who knew her had reasons to stay quiet. Maybe the truth was not missing because investigators failed, but because it belonged to a world designed not to leave records behind. That is why this theory remains so difficult to ignore. But it also has to be treated with caution. A case can resemble espionage without proving espionage. A person can use aliases without being an agent. A person can travel with foreign money without carrying secrets. A person can keep coded notes for private reasons. A person can hide identity because of crime, fear, shame, mental distress, or personal danger. The spy theory fits the mood of the file. It fits the era. It fits the symbols. But fitting the mood is not the same as solving the death. And this is where many retellings of the case become too confident. They treat the Cold War as an answer when it may only be a background. They treat secrecy as a profession when it may have been survival. They turn a woman into a spy because spy stories are easier to understand than a life that may have been broken, hunted, compromised, or deliberately erased for reasons we no longer know. The fourth explanation sits in the space between the ordinary and the political. Perhaps the Isdal woman was not an intelligence officer at all. Perhaps she was connected to a private network. Smuggling, fraud, a dangerous relationship, a financial arrangement, a criminal contact, a life lived across borders because staying in one place had become impossible. This theory matters because it keeps the case human. Not every secret belongs to a state. Some secrets belong to money. Some belong to sex. Some belong to family. Some belong to fear. Some belong to a past that a person is trying to outrun. If the Isdal woman was connected to a private danger rather than a government operation, many details could still make sense. The aliases could protect her. The travel could reflect meetings or escape. The coded notes could track movement. The removed labels could prevent identification. The foreign money could simply belong to someone who crossed borders often. But this explanation also has a weakness. It is broad, almost too broad. It can absorb many facts because it does not have to name a specific network. And a theory that can explain everything in general can sometimes prove very little in particular. Still, it keeps open an important possibility. The case may feel like espionage because espionage is the most dramatic form of secrecy, not necessarily because it is a correct one. The fifth explanation is the quietest and perhaps the saddest, that she was a woman in crisis. Not a spy, not a criminal, not a victim of a grand operation, but someone whose life had become fragmented beyond the point where ordinary identity could hold. In this version, the aliases are not tradecraft. They are escape. The travel is not a mission. It is flight. The removed labels are not intelligence discipline. They are self-erasure. The coded notes are not spy records. They are private control in a life that was losing control. This explanation does not have the glamour of espionage. It does not give the case a villain. It does not satisfy the hunger for a hidden network. But it has to remain on the table because human beings do not always collapse in ways that look simple from the outside. A person can appear elegant and controlled in a hotel lobby while carrying a private catastrophe no witness can see. A person can move through cities with precision while falling apart internally. A person can build a system of concealment not because she is serving a state, but because she no longer knows how to exist openly as herself. And yet this theory also leaves a wound. If she was only trying to erase herself, why did she leave behind such a strangely traceable pattern? Why did the objects feel so deliberate? Why did her movements seem so organized? Why did the file gather so many details that appear to point beyond private despair? That is the trap of the Isdal case. Every theory explains a mystery by making one part of the file heavier than the others. The suicide theory emphasizes the final act. The murder theory emphasizes the possibility of violence. The spy theory emphasizes the Cold War atmosphere and the signs of concealment. The criminal network theory emphasizes hidden relationships and private danger. The personal crisis theory emphasizes loneliness, identity, and collapse. But none of them can hold all the facts without strain. And maybe that is why the Isdal Woman has remained so powerful. She stands at the intersection of several kinds of fear. The fear of being watched, the fear of being hunted, the fear of disappearing, the fear of being used by forces larger than yourself, the fear of dying so far from home that even your name cannot find you. Most mysteries survive because one answer is missing. This one survives because too many answers seem possible, and each one changes who she was. If she was a spy, she becomes a figure of Cold War secrecy. If she was murdered, she becomes a victim of a hidden enemy. If she died by suicide, she becomes a woman whose final despair was wrapped in layers no one could read. If she was fleeing something, she becomes a person pursued by a past that never entered the file. And if she was all of these things in fragments, vulnerable, secretive, intelligent, afraid, careful, alone, then the most honest answer may be the hardest one to accept. The Isdal Woman may not be unsolved because the world overlooked one obvious clue. She may be unsolved because the truth was never contained in a single explanation. It was scattered across a life that had already been broken into aliases before anyone found her in the valley. The Isdal Woman case is often described as a spy mystery, and that description is understandable. It has the atmosphere. It has the setting. It has the Cold War. It has the aliases, the coded notes, the hotel rooms, the railway station, the foreign money, the missing labels, and the burned body in a valley that already sounded like a place from a secret file. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper wound in the case. Because the Isdal Woman does not only reveal how seductive espionage can be as an explanation, it reveals how fragile identity becomes when the ordinary systems that are supposed to hold a person fail. A name is supposed to do something simple. It is supposed to connect a body to a life. It links a person to a family, a country, a language, a record, a memory. It allows police to move backward from death into biography. It allows grief to find the right door. But in this case, the name never arrived. The investigation had evidence. The public had theories. The newspapers had a title. But the woman herself remained behind a locked surface. That is why the case still feels so disturbing. Not because secrecy existed. Secrecy exists everywhere. Governments keep secrets. Criminals keep secrets. Families keep secrets. People in pain keep secrets from others, and sometimes from themselves. What makes this case different is that secrecy outlived the person who carried it. Even after death, it continued to protect something or someone, or perhaps no one at all. And that is the terrible power of the file. It shows that a modern state can recover a body, preserve objects, interview witnesses, analyze chemicals, map movement, and still fail to restore the most basic human fact. Who was she? This is also why the spy theory remains so tempting. It gives the silence a structure. It tells us that the missing name was not an accident. It tells us that someone knew, someone concealed, someone benefited. And maybe that is true. But it is also possible that the truth is less cinematic and more painful. That she was not protected by a secret agency. That no powerful network carefully buried her name. That she was simply a woman whose real life had become unreachable by the time the world started looking for it. In that possibility, the case becomes even colder, because it means a person can pass through hotels, stations, borders, and cities while becoming less knowable with every step. It means the world can notice a woman only after it's too late to ask her who she was. And it means that the most haunting mysteries are not always the ones with the biggest conspiracies. Sometimes they're the ones where a human being leaves behind just enough evidence to prove she existed, and not enough to bring her back. In the end, the Isdal Woman remains suspended between several stories. A spy story, a murder story, a suicide story, a story of flight, a story of fear, a story of a woman who may have been hiding from the world or hidden by it. The valley gave investigators a body. The suitcases gave them objects. The hotel records gave them names. The coded notes gave them movement. But none of it gave them the truth that mattered most. Not the name she was born with. Not the home she came from. Not the person who last knew her fully. And so the case still returns to that cold afternoon outside Bergen. A narrow valley, wet stone, winter air, the smell of smoke where no fire should have been. A woman found at the end of a trail that seemed to lead everywhere except back to herself. More than 50 years later, the most disturbing possibility is not that the Isdal Woman had a secret. It is that the secret may have survived her completely. If there is one final image left in this file, it is not the fire. It is not the hotel rooms. It is not even the coded notes. It is 2 suitcases waiting in a railway station, filled with the fragments of a life, but missing the one thing that could have made those fragments human again, a name. And until that name is found, the Isdal Woman will remain what the world made her after death. Not a solved case, not a closed file, but a question wearing the shape of a person. If you want more unsolved files where history, crime, and secrecy overlap, subscribe to Black File Society. And if there's another case you believe deserves to be reopened, leave it in the comments. Because sometimes the truth does not disappear all at once. Sometimes it waits in the details no one has connected yet.